Evelyn Harper stared at the crumpled envelope in her hands, its edges frayed from days spent at the bottom of her bag. The bold, formal lettering on the front bore the name of a law firm she didn't recognize. Inside was a letter informing her of an inheritance from a distant relative she couldn't recall. A house in the rural outskirts of Maple Hollow, a town she hadn't visited since childhood. It felt like a trap. But Evelyn had nothing holding her back in the city. No family, no career that inspired her, and barely enough money to cover her next month's rent. So with a mix of trepidation and curiosity, she packed what little she had and made the 3-hour drive to Maple Hollow, her car rattling like it might give up halfway there. The house was worse than she'd imagined. A crumbling Victorian structure stood at the end of a gravel road, its weathered facade blanketed with ivy and decades of grime. The windows stared back at her like lifeless eyes, the paint around them peeling like sunburnt skin. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and mildew. Evelyn shivered despite the warmth of the late afternoon. "Home sweet home," she muttered, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The lawyer had warned her it wasn't in great shape, but nothing could have prepared her for the oppressive silence that engulfed the place. It felt alive in a way that set her nerves on edge, as though the house was watching her, sizing her up. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through faded curtains. The wooden floors creaked beneath her boots, their groans echoing in the cavernous hallways. Every piece of furniture seemed to sag with exhaustion. Sofas with torn upholstery, a dining table scarred with burns and scratches, and a grandfather clock that had stopped ticking long ago. She dropped her bags in the front hall and wandered deeper into the house, her steps hesitant. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges, revealing layers of forgotten patterns beneath. As she explored, she found a strange rhythm to the creaks and groans of the house, as if it were breathing. And then, in the silence, Evelyn thought she heard it, a faint melodic whistle. It was distant, barely audible, and gone almost as soon as it began. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing back to her. "Nothing." She shook her head and laughed nervously. "Great, first day, and I'm already hearing things." By the time evening fell, Evelyn had unpacked enough to make one of the bedrooms livable. She found some old blankets in a trunk and draped them over the sagging mattress. As she settled in for the night, she reminded herself why she was here. A fresh start. Maybe the isolation would be good for her. No distractions, no toxic relationships, no past chasing her into every shadow. Yet as she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling above her, the whistle returned. This time it was louder, distinct though still distant. It floated through the walls like a ghostly lullaby, the tune oddly cheerful yet deeply unsettling. She bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she demanded, grabbing the flashlight she'd left by the bed. The house didn't answer, but the whistle continued. Evelyn followed the sound, her feet moving of their own accord. The flashlight's beam wavered as she walked down the long hallway, past doors that seemed to loom over her. The whistle grew fainter as she approached the end of the hall, then stopped entirely. She stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She wanted to turn back, but something about the absence of sound unnerved her even more. It was as if the house was holding its breath. "Get a grip, Evelyn," she muttered, forcing herself to head back to bed. But as she closed the door behind her, she could have sworn she heard a soft knock from inside the wall. Evelyn awoke with a sharp inhale, her body tensed as though she'd been yanked from a nightmare she couldn't remember. The room was dark, darker than she expected. The moonlight that had bathed the wallpaper earlier was gone, swallowed by thick clouds or something worse. She turned to the small digital clock she'd set on the floor beside her bed. 3:03 a.m. She blinked at the time, oddly struck by the precision of it. Why would she wake at exactly that moment? Then she heard it, the whistle, same tune, same rhythm, slightly louder. It came from behind the wall next to her bed, no longer a faint echo from the far end of the house. It was as though someone stood directly behind the plaster, whistling with slow, deliberate breath. The melody was cheerful, almost childlike, but wrong somehow. Each note seemed to dig beneath her skin. She sat up slowly, not daring to move too quickly. Her ears strained against the dark, trying to determine if it was just the wind funneling oddly through the decaying house. But it was unmistakably human. She pressed her ear to the wall. The wood was cold. As her cheek rested against it, she could feel something. Movement. Gentle vibrations. The whistle wasn't just sound, it had weight, like a living thing sliding through the walls. She recoiled, crawling backward until her spine hit the opposite wall. She grabbed her flashlight again and shone it around the room, its weak beam catching dust and cobwebs. But nothing else. The whistle stopped. Dead silence fell like a guillotine. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct raps from inside the same wall. Evelyn let out a strangled gasp. She stumbled out of the room, nearly tripping over the tangled blanket at her feet. The hallway was no better. Long, dark, and cold. The old wood beneath her feet moaned as if protesting every step. She flicked the flashlight toward the far end of the corridor. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating only emptiness. No shadows moving, no figures waiting. Still, her skin prickled. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. She could almost sense a presence behind her, just over her shoulder. When she turned, nothing. She found herself in the living room where she curled up on the lumpy couch beneath an old Afghan. The faint scent of cedar and something more metallic clung to the fabric. She didn't sleep again. She just sat, waiting for the dawn like a prisoner counting down the hours to release. By morning, the house was quiet again. No whistling, no knocking. She made coffee and paced the living room while sipping it from a chipped mug she found in the kitchen. Every creak of the floor and groan of the old pipes made her flinch. But daylight softened things. What had felt like supernatural terror in the dark now seemed maybe explainable. Mice in the walls? Pipes? Maybe an old air vent carrying sound? She forced herself to check the bedroom again. The wall looked completely normal. No holes, no cracks. She tapped it. Solid. But something inside her told her not to trust the surface. This house had secrets. That afternoon, she drove into town. Maple Hollow looked like it had been frozen in time sometime in the 80s. The buildings were squat, painted in sun-faded pastels, and the few people she passed on the street gave her cautious, assessing looks. She stopped at a small grocery store to stock up on essentials. The woman at the counter was elderly, gray hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her name tag read, Miriam. "You new in town?" Miriam asked without looking up from scanning. "Sort of. I inherited the old Harper house," Evelyn replied. The scanner stopped. Miriam looked up, her face suddenly unreadable. "You staying there alone?" Evelyn nodded. "Yeah, why?" Miriam's lips pressed together. "You just be careful out there, dear. That house has a way of getting under people's skin." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" But Miriam shook her head, returning to scanning. "Some walls are better left closed." That night, Evelyn sat in her room with a flashlight, journal, and a knife she found in the kitchen drawer. Just in case. She tried to go to sleep by 10 p.m., but her nerves wouldn't let her. Every time her eyelids drooped, the tune replayed in her mind. She didn't need an alarm clock to wake at 3:03 a.m. It was waiting for her. Right on time, the whistling began again, this time from inside the ceiling. And this time, there were footsteps. Soft, dragging, overhead. Evelyn gripped the knife tightly and stared at the ceiling, heart hammering in her chest as the tune whistled on. The sound of footsteps on the ceiling didn't match the usual complaints of an old house. These weren't the sharp clicks of wood settling, nor the scampering of rats. They were soft, dragging, like someone barefoot and heavy was crawling just above her. The whistling had shifted now, slower, lower, as if the unseen entity were struggling to remember the tune, or mocking its own memory of it. Evelyn stood motionless, staring up. The beam from her flashlight flicked nervously across the ceiling. Plaster dust trembled with every step from above. Something was definitely up there in the crawlspace, or worse, in the attic. But hadn't the lawyer said the attic had been sealed? She stepped out into the hallway, pulse racing. The tune stopped abruptly the moment her foot crossed the threshold, as though the thing inside the house was aware of her movement. A cold draft drifted down the hall, smelling faintly of mildew and something far more sour, something like spoiled meat. She found the pull string to the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. It dangled above her like a limp noose. Evelyn hesitated. Her hand hovered, then dropped. Don't be an idiot, she thought. Go back. Call someone in the morning. Do this in daylight. But some grotesque curiosity overpowered her common sense. She grabbed a chair from the nearest room, climbed it slowly, and reached for the string. It resisted her first tug, almost as though it didn't want to move. Then with a sudden crack, the attic door groaned open, and the wooden ladder unfolded stiffly. A blast of freezing air blew down from above, curling around her like cold fingers. She pointed her flashlight up. All she could see was blackness and dust dancing in the beam. Her throat tightened. Then came the sound, not whistling now, but breathing. Slow, raspy, wet. It echoed down the attic opening, as though something just above the ladder was watching her, barely a foot away, cloaked in the dark. Evelyn stumbled back, the chair wobbling beneath her. She caught herself just in time and scrambled away, yanking the ladder back up with a slam. The attic door shut with a dull thud, sealing whatever was up there in for now. She sat on the hallway floor for what felt like hours, her back pressed to the wall, flashlight shaking in her hands. The breathing had stopped, but the weight of it hung in the air. That night she didn't sleep. She didn't even go back into her room. She curled up on the old hallway runner rug, her back to the wall, never to the door. The next morning, Evelyn returned to the attic hatch. This time the air was still. No sound, no breathing. Nothing. Almost as though the house was mocking her for being afraid. She went into town again, this time with a purpose. Find out who used to live in that house. The local library was a squat brick building that smelled like old glue and forgotten secrets. A librarian named Tom, a man in his 60s, with permanent crow's feet and nicotine-stained fingers, raised an eyebrow when she asked about the Harper place. Your great-uncle Marlowe lived there until he disappeared, he said, flipping through a yellowed logbook. Back in '92. Disappeared? Evelyn asked. Tom nodded slowly. Left everything behind, car still in the driveway, dinner still on the table, just gone. Evelyn shivered. Did he ever say anything? About the house? About hearing things? Tom hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice. Look, some of us knew Marlowe, bit of a recluse. Told people the house was alive. Said there was something in the walls watching him, whistling to him at night. Nobody believed him. Thought he'd cracked from loneliness. Evelyn went still. He heard it too. Tom gave her a strange look. You're hearing it now? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He handed her a faded file. We keep odd cases here. Don't ask why. Some people say Marlowe kept a journal. Wrote about what he saw. It was never recovered. But if it exists, it's probably still in that house. Evelyn clutched the file, her fingers going numb. That night, she returned to the house with a purpose. Find Marlowe's journal. She searched room after room, tearing through closets, drawers, even prying open a sealed floorboard. Nothing. But when she entered the master bedroom, a room she hadn't dared go into until now, she felt it instantly. A draft. There was a vent in the wall, unusually large, old-fashioned, sealed shut with rusted screws. She pried it open with a screwdriver. A deep, square shaft lay behind it, too narrow to crawl into, but just large enough to hold something. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth and tied with twine, was a leather-bound book. On the cover, scrawled in uneven, scratchy penmanship, The Whistler. Evelyn's hands trembled as she carefully untied the twine, binding the leather journal. The cover was cracked and stained, the scent of mildew and old paper rising like a ghost from its pages. She flipped it open, the brittle sheets whispering secrets long forgotten. The first entry was dated June 14th, 1987. The house is alive. It breathes and watches, whispering in the walls at night. The whistle follows me everywhere now. I tried to ignore it, but it grows louder with each passing day. I fear it knows my name. Her heart pounded. This was Marlowe's handwriting. The next pages described his slow descent into obsession. He wrote of restless nights spent listening to the whistle, of shadows moving just beyond sight, and voices that echoed from inside the walls themselves. One entry caught her eye. I called it the Whistler. It mimics the tune I hum when alone. It whispers secrets, then knocks in reply. I tried to whistle back. It answered, but the sound changed, became darker, angry. I fear the house has claimed me. Evelyn shivered and glanced around the room. The walls seemed to close in on her. The whispering whistle was back low, distant, but unmistakable. She read on. Marlowe had detailed a pattern. The whistle always began at exactly 3:03 a.m., growing louder as midnight approached, until it crescendoed just before dawn. He believed it was a curse tied to the house, a restless spirit trapped within the walls, hungry for release. But release meant possession. The final pages were frantic, barely legible. The Whistler calls me. It knows I'm weak. I can feel it crawling beneath the plaster, dragging me closer to madness. If anyone finds this, beware. Don't whistle back. Evelyn closed the journal. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside, the house groaned, and the whistle began again, softer this time as if it were testing her. The day had crawled by like a slow poison seeping into Evelyn's veins. She barely ate, barely moved, her mind tangled in Marlowe's frantic words and the dread of the approaching night. Each hour dragged her closer to the witching hour, that unholy moment Marlowe had marked with terror, 3:03 a.m. She had forced herself to prepare. Candles were placed in every corner of her room, their flickering flames battling the shadows that crept along the cracked walls. The old journal lay open on the bedside table, its fragile pages under the light of a single lamp. The house was silent, but Evelyn's heart thudded loud enough to drown out any other sound. Minutes before 3 a.m., she sat on the edge of the bed, gripping a small silver whistle she had found among Marlowe's things. She didn't know why she kept it. Something about it felt both sinister and protective, like a talisman against the darkness. The clock beside her glowed faintly in the gloom. 2:59 a.m. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her trembling hands. 3 a.m. The first soft notes began, a distant, ethereal whistle threading its way through the silence of the house. Evelyn's pulse quickened. It was the tune, the same melody Marlowe had heard, a cruel lullaby that danced on the edge of sanity. 3:01 a.m. The whistle grew louder, closer, weaving through the walls like an invisible serpent. It slithered beneath the floorboards and curled around the rafters above, squeezing the air from the room. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold bite deeper with every note. 3:02 a.m. Her breath caught as the tune shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The melody was no longer sweet or distant, it was mocking, twisted into something darker, almost hungry. Her eyes darted to the silver whistle in her hand, a compulsion rising within her. She didn't know why, but something urged her to respond, to join the melody, to whistle back. Her lips parted slightly and a soft note escaped, trembling in the thick air. The whistle faltered, then answered, louder and harsher, the sound no longer a song but a warning. It twisted through the walls, sharp and broken, an echo of her own tone but warped into something alien. Suddenly a loud knock shattered the stillness, pounding from the wall behind her bed, 3 sharp, thunderous raps. Evelyn jumped to her feet, heart hammering so violently she was sure it would burst from her chest. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in with an unseen pressure. A sudden gust of icy wind burst through the room, rattling the window panes with such force the glass trembled. The curtains whipped like ghostly hands reaching for her, and then with a violent slam the window shut, sealing her inside the dark prison. Her flashlight flickered wildly, sputtering and finally dying, leaving her swallowed by absolute darkness. Evelyn's breath hitched in the void. She was utterly alone, or so she hoped. Then from the inky blackness, the whistle returned. But it was different now, closer, deeper, and raw with rage. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It was a roar beneath the surface of the house, a chilling howl of something ancient and malevolent. And then came a voice, low, rasping, almost a growl. A whisper curling like smoke from the walls. Leave, before it's too late. The words slithered through the darkness, seeping into her skin. Her blood ran cold. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was a trick, a hallucination born from fear and exhaustion. But something primal told her it was real. The house was alive, and it was angry. For a long, paralyzing moment, Evelyn stood frozen, the echo of the warning vibrating in her ears. Then the walls seemed to breathe, the whisper turning into a chorus of faint, chilling voices, all whistling, knocking, and pleading from behind the plaster. She stumbled backward, tripping over the bedpost, crashing onto the floor. Her mind screamed to escape, but her body refused to move. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the freezing air. Shadows gathered in the corners, writhing and twisting as if the darkness itself was alive. The whistle crescendoed into a deafening howl that pierced her soul. And then silence. Evelyn lay on the cold floor, trembling, the journal clutched to her chest like a lifeline. She knew one thing with terrifying clarity. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a trap. And tonight it had warned her once. Would she listen? The morning sunlight was a cruel lie. It filtered through the dusty curtains, casting long, thin fingers across the floor. But the warmth it promised never reached Evelyn's skin. She moved like a ghost through the house, her limbs heavy, her mind clouded by the events of the night. The ache in her muscles was nothing compared to the cold knot of fear that tightened in her chest. She had spent hours curled on the hallway floor, clutching Marlowe's journal like a lifeline. Every line in the battered pages whispered of despair and madness. The man who had come before her hadn't fought the house. He had been swallowed whole by it. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she traced the fading ink of an entry dated November 3rd, 1991. The walls are not what they seem. They breathe. They watch. I hear voices behind the plaster, singing the same wicked tune. I tried to leave, but the house won't let me. It has become my prison. Her eyes lifted to the cracked ceiling and peeling wallpaper. She realized then that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had been waiting for her. Desperate for answers, Evelyn rifled through every corner of the house she hadn't yet dared explore. She searched the attic hatch again, this time prying the floorboards near the fireplace and checking behind loose panels. In a narrow crawl space behind the wall, she found something unexpected. A brittle, folded bundle of old papers, tied with a faded ribbon. Her heart pounding, she unfolded the fragile documents. They were town records, ancient deeds, maps, and handwritten notes from a century ago. The paper was yellowed, but the words were clear. This land is cursed, built on the grounds of an old gathering place where rituals of dark nature were performed. Families vanished without trace. The house stands as a gateway, sealed by blood and whispered incantations. Beware the whistler, who guards the passage between worlds. Evelyn's breath caught. The house wasn't just a home. It was a prison for something older and darker than she could imagine. She flipped in through the papers further and found sketches of the house's foundation beams. Ancient symbols carved deep into the wood, almost invisible beneath decades of paint. One note scrawled in a frantic hand warned, "The walls hold shadows, fragments of those trapped within. They whisper their pain, but also their rage. The whistler feeds on fear." Only by silencing the song can the curse be broken. The weight of it crushed her chest. She glanced around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every creak. The house watched her, and it was waiting. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the house was breathing around her, pulsing with a life of its own. With the ancient papers in hand, she knew what she had to do next. Explore beneath the floorboards where the symbols were sketched. The old wooden floor groaned under her feet as she pried open a loose board near the fireplace. Below was a narrow cavity, dark and cold, filled with whispers that seemed to echo from a place beyond time. As she lowered her flashlight into the void, the beam caught faint scratches on the wood names, dates, and desperate messages carved into the joists. "Help me! Don't listen to the whistle! They took us!" Her skin crawled. The scratches looked fresh. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed her ankle. Evelyn jumped back, heart pounding wildly. The whistling started again, this time a slow, mournful song, weaving through the floorboards and up the walls. She realized the house wasn't just haunted by one spirit. It was a prison holding many, their suffering trapped in the wood and plaster. To escape, she would have to silence the whistler, but how? Evelyn knew that breaking the curse meant confronting the dark history head-on. With the journal, the ancient papers, and the cryptic carvings as her guide, she pieced together a terrifying truth. The whistler was bound to a ritual, one performed long ago to trap a malevolent spirit within the house. The ritual had to be undone, but the instructions were fragmented, written in an archaic dialect, mixed with symbols that seemed to writhe on the page. Late into the night, Evelyn prepared a small altar in the basement, the coldest, darkest part of the house where the presence was strongest. She lit candles, arranged herbs mentioned in the texts, and whispered the strange incantations she could decipher. As the clock neared midnight, the whistle began louder, angrier, filling the basement with its eerie melody. Shadows gathered, swirling into shapes that clawed at the flickering candlelight. Evelyn's voice trembled as she recited the final words. The air grew thick and heavy, the temperature plummeting. Suddenly, the candles extinguished, plunging her into darkness. A guttural growl filled the room as the whistler manifested a twisted, shadowy figure with a mouth full of broken teeth, eyes glowing with unnatural light. Evelyn faced the entity alone, her heart pounding with terror and resolve. Evelyn's hands shook violently as she gripped the journal, the worn leather cover slick with cold sweat. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting long, writhing shadows that danced along the cracked basement walls. The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, but she refused to give in. The whispering whistle swelled into a guttural roar, a sound that clawed at her very soul. From the shadows before her, the whistler began to take shape, a twisted, nightmarish figure. Its form was jagged and broken, like shards of shattered glass held together by an invisible force. Its mouth was a jagged maw filled with rows of broken, yellowed teeth, some missing, others sharp as razors. Its eyes burned with an unnatural, malevolent light that seemed to pierce through Evelyn's defenses. The entity lunged forward with a terrible scream, a noise that shattered the silence like splintering bone, and tortured screams entwined into one agonizing howl. Evelyn stumbled back, nearly dropping the journal, but her resolve held firm. This was her battle, the final stand. The candle flames flared suddenly, as if responding to her defiance, illuminating the basement with a warm, trembling glow. She seized the moment and grabbed the small pouch of salt and dried herbs from the altar. With trembling fingers, she scattered them in a wide circle around herself, the crystals crunching sharply against the stone floor. The whistler hissed, a serpentine sound full of rage and desperation. Its smoky tendrils writhed like living shadows, slithering and twisting, attempting to seep through the protective circle. But the salt burned them, causing the shadows to recoil with a shriek that echoed through the basement's hollow chambers. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps. The ancient words from Marlowe's journal echoed in her mind, the incantation that bound the spirit long ago. She forced herself to whisper the final phrase, voice barely audible but unwavering. By the light of truth, I bind thee. The whistler let out a piercing scream, a sound so full of pain and fury it felt like the walls themselves were cracking. The figure's monstrous form trembled, then began to splinter, breaking apart like shattered glass caught in a storm. Tendrils of smoke and shadow were sucked back into the walls, writhing and struggling, until finally the last echo of the whistle faded into a haunting, sorrowful silence. Evelyn collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The oppressive weight that had suffocated the house lifted, replaced by a fragile stillness. For a moment, she dared to hope it was over. But as she rose, clutching the journal close to her chest, she knew that some shadows never fully vanish. They only wait. The first rays of dawn spilled gently through the grime-coated windows, casting a soft, golden glow across the battered floors and faded wallpaper. The oppressive heaviness that had gripped the house for so long seemed to lift with the light, like a dark storm finally breaking. Evelyn sat on the creaking wooden steps of the porch, her fingers still trembling as they curled tightly around the fragile journal. Her body ached with exhaustion, every muscle screaming from the night's ordeal, but inside her chest, a fragile ember of hope glowed. The house was silent now. No more whispers slithered from behind the walls. No more chilling whistles cut through the stillness like knives. The sinister presence that had haunted every shadow, every breath, had been pushed back into the dark corners where it belonged. For a long moment, she simply sat, feeling the warm morning breeze brush against her face, the sweet scent of pine and damp earth mingling with the fading echoes of dread. She knew the house would never be truly free. The scars of the past, carved into the foundation and sealed in the walls, would remain silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded within. But she had broken the cycle. She had faced the whistler, stared into the abyss, and refused to be consumed. As Evelyn rose to her feet, a soft whistle drifted through the rustling leaves of the ancient oaks surrounding the property. It was faint, almost too delicate to hear. A gentle, melancholic melody that seemed to echo from a distant place a lullaby carried on the wind. Her heart tightened. For a brief, shivering moment, fear gripped her once more. But the tune was different, not threatening, not cruel. It was a farewell, a sigh of release. Evelyn allowed herself a small, weary smile. The house had said goodbye. She turned away from the porch, stepping down the creaking stairs and onto the gravel path that led away from the old, haunted place. The journal tucked safely under her arm, she walked toward the rising sun, toward the promise of life beyond the walls of terror. The past was behind her. The future waited uncertain, but hers to claim.